Best practice in Python for return value on error versus success. In general, let's say you have a method like the below. In this particular method, when errors are found, I would not want to return the empty list in this case because that could have been the real answer to this specific method call. I want to return something to indicate the parameters were incorrect. So I returned false on error in this case, and a list otherwise, empty or not. My question is, what is the best practice in areas like this, and not just for lists? Return whatever the heck I want and make sure I document it for a user to read. Smile, what do most of you folks do? If on success you were supposed to return true or false and you catch an error. If on success you were supposed to return a list and you catch an error. If on success you were supposed to return a file handle and you catch an error. Etc.
First, whatever you do, don't return a result and an error message. That's a really bad way to handle errors and will cause you endless headaches. If you need to indicate an error, always raise an exception. I usually tend to avoid raising errors unless it is necessary. In your example, throwing an error is not really needed. Intersecting an empty list with a non-empty one is not an error. The result is just empty list and that is correct. But let's say you want to handle other cases. For example, if the method got a non-list type. In this case, it is better to raise an exception. Exception are nothing to be afraid of. My advice for you is to look at the Python library for similar functions and see how Python handles those special cases. For example, have a look at the intersection method in set. It tends to be forgiving. Here I'm trying to intersect an empty set with an empty list. Errors are only thrown when needed. Sure, there are cases where returning true or false on success or failure can be good. But it is very important to be consistent. The function should always return the same type or structure. It is very confusing to have a function that could return a list or a boolean, or return the same type, but the meaning of this value can be different in case of an error. Edit. The op says, I want to return something to indicate the parameters were incorrect. Nothing says there is an error better than an exception. If you want to indicate the parameters are incorrect, then use exceptions and put a helpful error message. Returning a result in this case is just confusing. There might other cases where you want to indicate that nothing has happened, but it is not an error. For example, if you have a method that deletes entries from a table and the entry requested for deletion does not exist. In this case, it might be fine to just return true or false on success or failure. It depends on the application and the intended behavior.
It'd be better to raise an exception than return a special value. This is exactly what exceptions were designed for, to replace error codes with a more robust and structured error handling mechanism. In this specific case though, I'd probably just drop the tests. There's nothing wrong with intersecting empty lists, really. Also, Lambda is sort of discouraged these days in preference to list comprehensions. See find intersection of two nested lists for a couple of ways to write this without using Lambda.
I like to return a tuple. True, sum_result false, sum_useful_response. The sum_useful_response object can be used for handling the return condition, or can serve to display debugging info. Note, this technique applies for return values of any sort. It should not be mistaken with exception cases. On the receiving end, you just have to unpack. Code, response equals sum_function. This technique applies for the normal control flow. One must use the exception functionality when some unexpected inputs, processing occur. Also worth noting, this technique helps normalizing function returns. Both the programmer and the user of the functions know what to expect. Disclaimer: I come from an Erlang background. Smile. Exceptions are definitely better and more Pythonic than status returns. For much more on this, exceptions versus status returns.
The general case is to throw exceptions for exceptional circumstances. I wish that I could remember the exact quote, or who said it, but you should strive for functions that accept as many values and types as is reasonable and maintain a very narrowly defined behavior. This is a variant of what Nadia was talking about. Consider the following usages of your function. I would expect that 5 throws an exception since passing false is a type error. The rest of them, however, make some sort of sense, but it really depends on the contract that the function states. If intersect_2_lists were defined as returning the intersection of two iterables, then everything other than 5 should work as long as you make none a valid representation of the empty set. The implementation would be something like: I usually write helper functions that enforce whatever the contract is and then call them to check all of the preconditions. Something like: You can also extend this concept and pass in the policy as an optional argument. I would not advise doing this unless you want to embrace policy-based design. I did want to mention it just in case you haven't looked into this option before. If the contract for intersect_2_lists is that it only accepts 2 non-empty list parameters, then be explicit in throw exceptions if the contract is breached. I think that the moral of the story is whatever you do it consistently and be explicit. Personally, I usually favor raising exceptions whenever a contract is breached or I am given a value that I really cannot use. If the values that I am given are reasonable, then I try to do something reasonable in return. You might also want to read the C++ fact-like entry on exceptions. This particular entry gives you some more food for thought about exceptions.
If you want to support the channel, please consider subscribing.